Indicate by saying if you're present from your annex office or from your district. I do think we have a quorum. I know one of our members just stepped out. But if Chris, if you would, please call the roll.
Senator Carr, Senator Neal, Senator Wilson, Representative Bojanowski,
Present in person.
Representative Huff, Representative Riley, Co-Chair Wise,
Present in the room.
Co-Chair Reed.
Here in the room.
I think Representative Riley has stepped out, so.
And Representative Senator Wise, I'm here.
Thank you, Representative. Gotcha.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. All those that are meeting with us in the room, if you do have a cell phone, if you please would just turn that to silence or to vibrate, it'll be greatly appreciated. And all materials have been sent out electronically via email, which should also be available on the committee LRC website. Since we do have a quorum, I would like to go ahead and get a motion to approve the October 5th minutes. We have a motion. Do we have a second? We have a second. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please do so by saying aye. All those opposed?
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Today we have a presentation from the Office of Education Accountability. They're here to present a report on NTI instruction entitled From Snowbound Pilot to Statewide Implementation, Lessons Learned from Kentucky's NTI Program. I know that our speakers are already present at the table, but if you would please, as you speak, please identify yourselves for the record. Dr. Liguori, I'm looking at you, so I'm going to go ahead and let you start first, sir. Thank you.
Bart Liguori, Office of Education Accountability.
Chris Riley, Office of Education Accountability.
Deborah Nelson, also Office of Education Accountability.
Great. Thank you all so much, and whoever wishes to take the lead, I'll let you proceed.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Riley with the Office of Education Accountability.
And I'm Deborah Nelson, and we will be sharing this presentation. This report analyzes data related to Kentucky's non-traditional instruction, or NTI program, as it was originally implemented and as it was modified during the COVID-19 pandemic to allow for extended remote learning. While these two phases cannot be directly compared, remote learning during the pandemic may offer insights for the NTI program as it is normally implemented. NTI was an innovative program that was effective in achieving key program goals with no apparent effects on student achievement, as the program is normally implemented for up to 10 days per year. The extended remote learning in 2021 was, however, associated with negative academic outcomes. The degree to which these negative outcomes are caused by remote learning versus other factors impacting students during the COVID-19 pandemic are not yet clear. Districts' capacities to provide remote instruction increased greatly since the program began, but student home internet and device access remained a barrier. Student home access gaps were narrowed substantially during the pandemic, and accurate data on student home access is important. During COVID-era NTI, the range of instructional options on NTI days increased, especially options for synchronous instruction, which may be important to sustain for some students. Finally, attendance during NTI is measured through student participation. Participation rates appear very similar to attendance rates on the surface, and surface district-level data are what are normally available. Student-level participation data collected for the first time in 2021 show trends not evident from district NTI data. Some of the data in the report raise questions about standards that are used by schools in reporting participation data. Many of the report's recommendations focus on those questions. OEA used a variety of data from the Kentucky Department of Education. Of particular value to the study was the statewide student-level participation data first collected by KDE in 2021. Kentucky was one of only 2 states to collect these data and has been identified as a national leader by the nonprofit Attendance Works for that reason. Kentucky may be the only state in the nation to know remote instruction rates at the student level. Staff also analyzed policies in surrounding states and reviewed national literature. As a limitation, the study does not address COVID-specific issues such as virus mitigation efforts. Also, due to COVID, the study contains very limited data from Kentucky educators. For that reason, it also does not do justice to some of the truly innovative aspects of the program. The full report does contain some anecdotal data, which we would be happy to share with you during the question period. We'll move now to look at background and statutory requirements of the program. The General Assembly created the NTI program in 2011, which was a very high weather year in which many districts did not meet calendar requirements for 1,062 instructional hours. The program allowed up to 10 remote student attendance days only for very high weather districts experiencing an average of 20 or more weather days per year. The following year, 3 districts entered the program. Following another very high weather year, the General Assembly extended program eligibility to all districts, and new districts entered in 2015. In each of the subsequent years, about half of Kentucky districts were participating in the program as of 2019. In 2018, the General Assembly added oversight and reporting requirements. When schools were closed for in-person instruction in March of 2020, all districts entered the program and the 10-day limit was extended. That 10-day limit has been reinstated this school year. And the report refers to 2 distinct phases of the program, NTI pre-COVID and COVID-era NTI. For the statutory requirements of the program, allows up to 10 student attendance days to be counted per year per district when the district is otherwise closed for health and safety. And as the report notes, districts are awarded a different number of instructional hours per day depending on their regular district calendar. To participate in the program, districts must have NTI plans that are approved by KDE. Statute also requires that daily attendances for purposes of school funding be determined through regulation. Based on the regulation, attendance on NTI days themselves is not used in funding calculations. Reporting and oversight must also be outlined in regulation. Statute requires that districts provide evidence of continued student learning on NTI days, and that is the only criteria that statute requires districts to report. So much of this presentation will focus on data related to that requirement. Statute also requires that regulation describe ongoing evaluative requirements of districts. Those requirements have not yet been clarified in KDE's revised NTI plan process, so OEA has a recommendation related to that point. Statute also requires that NTI only be provided when the entire district is closed for health or safety reasons. COVID-era NTI allowed closure in individual schools. Although that flexibility was pandemic-related, it offers potential advantages in the future. It is sometimes necessary for districts to close individual schools for health and safety reasons, and boards do not currently have the authority to require that learning continue in those closed schools, even if it is possible. Most often, instructional hours for students in those schools are lost. This is most common where things like water main breaks, or we recently had an example in Franklin County where a school was closed for several days because of bats. So related to that, OEA has a recommendation that the General Assembly may wish to consider permitting NTI in individual schools. Related to the previous point about evaluation, OEA recommends that KDE clarify the evaluative requirements of districts. We'll move now to look at statutory requirements in other states. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia had similar programs prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Like Kentucky, those states required state approval of district plans. And with the possible exception of Indiana, Kentucky allowed a greater number of days than surrounding states. Kentucky was the only state to require district reporting and additional state oversight beyond approval of plans. And the next slide describes these additional requirements in Kentucky. Like other states, Kentucky requires state approval of NTI plans, and in Kentucky, those plans must include a variety of specific elements. A few are listed on this slide. In addition, regulation requires that districts submit documentation for each NTI day taken, as listed on the slide. KDE approves NTI days one at a time. Districts are required to keep a variety of additional documents, and KDE may review those documents in district audits. The report focuses heavily on student participation data because it is the best potential source of data to meet the statutory requirement for evidence that student learning continues on NTI days. We'll return briefly to discuss these monitoring requirements in a moment, but we'll first provide more background about student participation data. Student participation data substitutes for attendance, which is not taken on NTI days. Whereas attendance is normally based on in-person instructional time, student participation uses performance-based metrics such as student work or software login. Normally, each district uses its own method and software to record and report student participation data. For each NTI day used, it submits overall numbers to KDE. In 2021, for the first time, KDE required that participation data be entered directly into the state student information system, Infinite Campus. Also in 2021, KDE conducted its first ever review of student-level participation data, looking at evidence behind district data provided for individual students' participation. This type of student-level participation review may offer greater insights than the review of aggregate district-level data that are normally reported.
This section of the presentation will discuss weather closures for districts during the 2011 through the 2019 school years for both NTI districts and districts not in the program as of 2019. This map provides perspective on weather closures by district. The map is shaded according to the average number of weather-related closures, including NTI days for school years 2011 to 2019. The districts shaded in the darkest gray were the 23 districts with the highest average weather closures during that time period. Those Eastern Kentucky districts had on average 13 to 20 weather closures per school year. NTI districts are in all regions of the state, but notice that there were some high weather districts that had not yet joined the NTI program as of 2019. Likewise, there were some lower weather districts that had entered the program. For reference, there's a copy of this map at the end of the presentation in your packets that shows the districts that were in the NTI program as of 2019. This chart shows the comparison of average annual weather and NTI days for NTI districts relative to non-NTI districts. Each school year on the chart has comparison bars with non-NTI districts on the left and NTI districts on the right, except for the 2011 school year, which preceded the NTI program. Take note that there were only 3 districts in the NTI program for school years 2012 to 2014, and the NTI comparison groups only include the districts in the NTI program for each of those school years. The stacked bars for the NTI districts show both weather and NTI days. The weather days are shown in black, and the NTI days are shown in gray. As you can see, NTI districts used a mixture of weather and NTI days each year to meet annual instructional hour requirements. On average, NTI districts used 5.4 NTI days per year between 2011 and 2019. Action was taken by the General Assembly to waive instructional hours for districts that were unable to meet the 1,062 instructional hour requirement required per year for the school years 2014 through 2016, but it has not been necessary for the General Assembly to do so since then. This can be attributed to factors such as more districts entering the NTI program during the subsequent school years, and the fact that the winter weather closures have not reached the level seen in 2014 and 2015. Data on this slide are calculated based on NTI days used by districts when the entire district was closed. The next slide will show remote learning rates of districts in the 2021 school year when all districts entered the program. In that year, students could learn remotely on NTI days on which the entire district was closed, as well as hybrid days when some students were learning in person and others remotely. This map shows the percentage of the instructional days that students learned remotely by district in 2021. Individual students within each district may have learned remotely at lower or higher rates. On average, 68% of the instructional days were remote. Remote instruction rates range broadly from a low of 10% to a high of 93%. Districts with higher remote rates included many rural districts as well as Jefferson County. On average, the percent of students living in poverty was greater in higher versus lower remote districts. Given higher rates of remote learning, technology became especially critical in 2021.
We'll begin by looking at technological advances since the program was implemented. Instruction on NTI days was initially based primarily on paper packets. By 2020, it had become predominantly digital in the middle and high schools, although elementary schools continued to use paper packets. Almost all districts had acquired learning management systems by 2020. These web-based systems link teachers, students, and assignments, and also have become increasingly sophisticated at capturing and storing data on student work and engagement. While districts were acquiring technology to provide digital instruction, students' lack of access to instructional devices and to the internet at home remained a challenge. At the state level, student home internet access increased from the beginning of the NTI program. By 2020, district-reported data indicated that 84% of students statewide had strong home internet access. But as you'll see on the next slide, as of 2020, immediately preceding the pandemic, most districts had a substantial minority of students that lacked access. This slide shows the number of districts reporting various percentages of student home internet access as of the fall of 2020. Districts participating in NTI program prior to the pandemic are shown in the black bar. On the far right, you can see 7 districts reporting 96% or more of students had access, and no NTI districts were in that category. On the far left, you can see a total of 12 districts reporting 60% or less of students with home internet access. The overwhelming majority of districts had at least 10% of students that lacked access. And you can see that this includes roughly equal numbers of NTI and non-NTI districts. And on average, access was lower in higher poverty districts. Lack of home internet access is an equity concern, not only during NTI, but during regular instruction. For example, research has shown that internet access is increasingly important for homework, and that students lacking access are at a disadvantage throughout the school year. During the COVID-19 crisis, districts were able to use an unprecedented influx of federal dollars to assist families with internet connection and purchase mobile devices. KDE data indicate that 98% of students had access at some location outside the school campus in 2021. KDE did not collect data on student home access in that year. Accurate data on student home access is important for local and state purposes. And while KDE has recommended systematic data collection for many years, about 40% of districts were estimating those data as of 2020. KDE began requiring systematic data collection as of this school year. And OEA recommends that the department continue to require systematic data collection. Related to technology, we'll note finally that the increase in student home access in the 2021 school year led to expansions in remote instructional options, especially synchronous instruction. Synchronous instruction was rare in NTI prior to the pandemic. Teachers were expected to be available during school hours and assist students by phone or email if requested. They were not normally required to instruct in real time or otherwise proactively engage with students. Students reported regular synchronous instruction in 2021, especially at the elementary level. And you can see that 25% of high school students did not report regular synchronous instruction in 2021. In addition to this survey data, anecdotal data indicate a broad range in students' access to synchronous instruction last year. Some schools provided synchronous instruction in every class. Others combined daily synchronous check-ins with independent work and synchronous tutoring for those who needed it. And we know that some schools provided little or no synchronous instruction throughout the week. In those schools, students learned almost entirely on software. While best practices for synchronous instruction are not yet known, especially for short-term remote instruction as is normally provided in NTI, synchronous instruction is likely important for some students. Parents surveyed by the Pritchard Committee for Academic Achievement identified the top factors in remote instruction to be synchronous, though not necessarily whole class. Parents placed highest priority on personalized guidance, and options for virtual tutoring were also highly valued. Synchronous instruction may be especially important for some student populations. In addition to those who require academic assistance and tutoring, it may be important for students needing social and emotional support. And synchronous instruction is necessary for some students. Many NTI districts receive Read to Achieve reading grants, for example, that assist struggling students in reading. According to program staff, Read to Achieve interventions can only be provided in person or through synchronous remote instruction. Given the importance of synchronous instruction to at least some students, and the fact that teachers were not required proactively to instruct or engage with students synchronously prior to the pandemic, it may be important to clarify the minimum amounts of synchronous instruction that should be available to students moving forward. OEA recommends that KDE establish minimum expectations for the amount of synchronous instruction that should at least be offered to students on NTI days.
The presentation will now shift to the discussion on attendance, including the findings from the student level data for 2021 and on some of the concerns associated with that data. As a reminder, NTI data are usually submitted to KDE as a district percentage. The report does review those district level percentages, but it focuses on the student level data that were collected in 2021. The next few slides are based on that student level 2021 data. On the surface, a comparison of state level attendance rates on regular instructional days and student level participation rates on NTI days were similar. For instance, the state-level participation rate for the 2021 school year was 93%, compared with an attendance rate of 94% for the 2019 school year, which was the most recent year in which attendance was calculated. But this aggregate data masked substantial differences at the student and school levels. For example, the chronic absence rate was 19% in 2019 for all students and increased slightly to 22% for the 2021 school year. However, the chronic absence rates nearly doubled from 2019 to 2021 for Black, Hispanic, and limited English proficiency students. The next slide shows that state-level chronic absence comparisons mask substantial differences among schools. This figure shows a school-level comparison of chronic absence rates for the 2019 and 2021 school years for schools grouped by poverty level as measured by the percentage of FRPL eligible students in those schools. The bars representing chronic absence are divided into three groups. The white portion of the bar represents the percentage of students chronically absent 10 to 20% of the school year, the gray section 21 to 30%, and the black section of the bar represents the percentage chronically absent more than 30% of the school year. The collective bar represents the overall chronic absence rate for that year. You can see that chronic absence rates increased for all schools during the 2021 school year, but the largest increase in chronic absence occurred in schools with the highest concentration of free and reduced price lunch eligible students. In those schools also had the most students that were absent more than 30% of the 2021 school year. Data shown later in the presentation suggests that the highest poverty schools also experienced disproportionate impacts on student achievement in 2021. Because student-level participation data reveal important patterns not evident in aggregate data and allow for better monitoring, OEA recommends that KDE should consider requiring NTI districts to enter student-level participation data in the State Student Information System for each NTI day. Student-level data allow for closer tracking of participation by students. It also allows for greater monitoring by administrators and KDE. We will move now to illustrate concerns raised in the report about whether student participation data as currently collected are valid as indicators of continued student learning and whether they are reliable indicators of differences among schools and districts. Analysis of the 2021 participation data raised questions about data quality. For instance, participation rates for in-person instruction were very different from remote participation rates. For example, at 16%, remote chronic absence rates for high school grade students were actually lower than chronic absence rates in 2019. But in-person chronic absence rates were much higher, almost double that for remote instruction for those students in 2021. This could mean that high school students are more likely to be engaged in learning on remote participation days than to attend school on in-person days. It may also indicate relatively lower standards that need to be met on in-person days in some schools. Some of the data in the report raise questions about how these standards are applied in different schools. For example, schools with similar 2019 attendance rates had very different remote participation rates in 2021. This slide will illustrate the comparison of school-level attendance rates in 2019 with the 2021 student participation rates. First, I will show the bars representing the 2019 attendance rates. The overwhelming majority of schools that year had attendance rates in the 93 to 96% range. There were 31 schools in 2019 with average attendance rates in the 97-98% range. 2021 school-level student participation rates fell within a much larger range relative to the attendance rates in 2019. There were 115 schools with student participation rates below 85% in 2021, compared to 2 schools in 2019. And there were 319 schools, including more than half of the middle and high schools with participation rates at 99% or more, compared to 0 schools in 2019. Schools that had similar attendance rates in 2019 had very different remote participation rates in 2021. For example, many of the schools within the 95% attendance rate range in 2019 reported almost perfect participation rates in 2021, whereas other schools within that range reported much lower participation rates. What can we conclude from this?
We do not know what to make of these data trends. It's possible that some schools are much more effective at others at engaging remote learners, and that 100% participation indicates learning and engagement by all students in a school. Data may also reflect differences in standards used by schools to consider a student participating, with the bar being relatively lower in some schools. As this slide will show, KDE guidance has permitted a broad range of criteria to support participation data. Previously, districts were permitted to determine their own criteria for participation. In 2021, KDE identified specific forms of evidence, one of which was required at least once per day. No minimum instructional hour equivalents have been associated with these criteria. This means that in some schools, a student could log in briefly to a learning management system and be considered as participating for the entire day. Other schools might require that a minimum amount of work be completed. In such a school, an 85% participation rate might be very good. It might even indicate a higher percentage of students actually completing work than is typical on a regular student attendance day. All states are facing challenges about how to best report student attendance during temporary remote learning. Some other states have established instructional hour equivalents that should be provided on remote learning days and to support participation data. Although no consensus exists currently about how remote participation should best be measured, minimum requirements for instructional hour equivalents might be helpful to eliminate extreme variation that we are seeing in the data. OEA offers a series of recommendations aimed at focusing greater attention on the quality of student participation data. OEA recommends first that KDE consider establishing minimum instructional hour equivalents for what should be indicated by participation data. This recommendation does not suggest that total remote participation be measured by precise indicators of time. Many experts recommend against that practice. Minimum requirements could, however, rule out a single login as evidence of participation. OEA also recommends that KDE require NTI district to designate a certified person at the school level to verify at least some of the participation data for each NTI day. Finally, OEA recommends that the department conduct annual participation data reviews, as it did in 2021, in select districts. These reviews would serve not only as data checks, but as learning opportunities. The processes recommended on the previous slide, or alternative ways of validating participation data in NTI districts, would provide more insight than KDE's current practice of reviewing daily data in aggregate. The quality of data can't be evaluated in this form, and KDE has never denied a district NTI days based on the quality of evidence submitted. Should KDE take steps to address the quality of participation data, it might reconsider whether it is necessary to require that districts submit documentation for each NTI day used, and that the department individually approve each of these days. OEA has one final recommendation related to participation data, and this is based on uncertainty about the degree of learning that can be measured on an NTI day. OEA recommends that the General Assembly consider establishing a standard number of instructional hours to be granted to districts on NTI days. As noted earlier in the presentation, some districts are receiving up to 1 instructional hour more than others for each NTI day. We'll look now at academic outcomes. Staff analyzed 2018 reading and mathematics scores of students in NTI and non-NTI districts, taking into account prior performance, total number of weather days and NTI days, years of NTI participation, and a variety of student demographic characteristics. While the quality of instruction on NTI days, and I should clarify, I'm talking about NTI pre-COVID here, likely varied, overall, OEA found no significant and substantial effects of NTI days on student performance. In other words, overall, state test data alone, and that was the only data available for this study, do not provide cause for concern about the quality of continued learning on NTI days compared with weather makeup days. And these weather makeup days can sometimes occur during the school year, but oftentimes they occur at the very end of the school year when schools had already planned to be closed for the year. As the next series of slides will show, higher remote learning rates were associated with drops in student performance in 2021, but the degree to which these drops were associated with remote learning versus other effects are not yet clear. The percentage of students considered proficient or distinguished on state tests dropped from 2019, the last year in which students were tested, and 2021, with decreases being slightly greater in math than in reading. Both of these trends, substantial drops in state test scores and decreases greater in mathematics than reading are common in states across the nation. The percentage of students meeting CPE college readiness benchmarks for the ACT also dropped by about 6 percentage points in each subject. This slide shows increases between 2019 and 2021 in the percentage of high school students failing at least one class, by subject and in any class. The percentage of students failing at least one math or English class increased by 7 percentage points, and the percentage of students failing at least one of any class increased by 11 percentage points. As shown in the report, increases were almost double and highest versus lower poverty schools. Again, the cause of increased failures in higher poverty schools is not entirely clear. While it could reflect the higher remote learning rates of students in these schools, it might also reflect the relatively greater toll taken by the pandemic on higher versus lower poverty communities. In conclusion, the NTI program allowed districts to continue learning and meet calendar requirements despite inclement weather. Districts use an average of 5.4 NTI days, or about 3% of the instructional year prior to the pandemic, rarely reaching the 10-day limit. In addition to implementing NTI days, districts continued to use weather days. Related to technology, district capacity has grown tremendously, but student home internet and device access remains a challenge. Federal funds allowed narrowing of gaps during the pandemic, but access remains an important equity concern for NTI and also during the regular school year. Accurate student home access data is important, and systematic data collection should be sustained. As just noted, OEA found no substantial effects of NTI on achievement pre-COVID, but substantial drops in student achievement during extended remote learning. Relative effects of remote learning versus other factors are not known. And finally, attendance rates and participation rates appear very similar on the surface. And in most years, including this year, these data are reported to KDE only at the surface level, at the district level. Closer analyses, especially those made possible by the student-level data collected only in the 2021 school year, reveal important trends not evident in aggregate data. In addition to this data point about chronic absence, the report contains some other data only possible to know through the student-level data. Student-level data also reveals some unusual trends, such as unexplained variation between in-person and remote chronic absence rates, and between what schools normally report for attendance and what they report for participation. And a number of our recommendations address this concern. And overall, while the NTI program pre-COVID achieved key goals with no apparent negative effects on student achievement, implementation of the NTI during the COVID crisis may offer important lessons moving forward. This concludes the presentation, and we'd be happy to take your questions about the presentation or the full report.
Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate y'all's research and levels of analysis that went into it, and a lot of very, let's say, sobering and very troubling information, to say the least, and a lot of stuff that's presented here. But great work in terms of getting down to the question of what we were looking to ask. I guess just a comment in terms of the definition of what is participation. I've found that looking at what was provided here, of I don't know how many schools in terms of if participation was just simply logging in to basically count attendance as participation. I'm going to take my legislator hat off, but as a parent, I find that very troubling if that is how we're going to define participation. So that's just a comment of, just looking at some of the things that are presented here. If you would look with me on, I think it's slide 24, if you can go to that real quickly, and then I'll turn a question over to Representative Bojanowski. But really quickly, on slide 24, entitled Number of Districts by Percentage of Students with Strong Home Internet Access. Yes. Do we know in terms of the breakdown of that, the districts that are highly concentrated in urban areas versus the concentration in rural areas. I guess what I'm trying to get at is many times we look at internet access and broadband, we say, well, it's just a rural issue. But do we also know how much of that is so much also the urban issue as well?
The appendix does include a map of the 2020 data.
That would be figure M1
Okay.
in the appendix, sir.
Perfect.
And as you'll see by that, overall percentages of access were lower in rural districts, but we know that student home access can also be a problem in urban communities because issues with connection are not only broadband access, but cost. So the cost of Wi-Fi plans are a significant challenge to many families. We know there were federal funds available for that, significant funds this school year, and those are going to run out.
Thank you all. Representative Bojanowski?
Thank you, sir. Just to follow up a little bit on what Senator Wise said, I think one issue with access was in the first iteration of NTI when we were before the summer, we had a lot of families where multiple children had to share one device. And so even if they had internet access, they didn't, because they didn't. I believe that in the district, we did have more of a one-on-one goal at that point. And then when school started up again, that was less of an issue. I do want to comment on how I was directed to take attendance. I did teach NTI for a full year. Had to shift to a standing desk because I couldn't sit that many hours, but we were directed, definitely if a student turned in a document, if a student logged into a Google Meet, but we were also directed, or what I understood is that if I texted a parent and got a response, that counted as an attendance. So I do agree that if, heaven forbid we have another pandemic, that we very much clarify what that is. But then also reflecting on the data I collected with my students and trying to think of if we had to track how many minutes or hours they actually had synchronous instruction, that also could be highly problematic because a lot of children would log into their Google Meet, turn off their screen, and have at it with their video games. So that would not necessarily count as synchronous instruction either. So I think the best answer is that we just keep schools doing school in person, but it's a couple of just thoughts about attendance. And then I do agree on increasing the synchronous instruction, but I think we get to a point where is it developmentally appropriate for a child to sit 6 or 7 years in front of a screen, which also is not true. So thank you very much, but those are kind of my thoughts from living NTI.
Thank you, Representative. Any other questions, any comments from any members? Anyone remotely? Any comments, questions to the presenters today? We have a motion to accept the report as is presented to us today. Do we have a second on that? We have a second from Senator Wilson and also Representative Bojanowski. All those in favor of accepting the report, please do so by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so much once again for your work and your research on this. Last thing on the agenda for today is each year this subcommittee performs, it's next on the agenda is the Office of Education Accountability 2022 Research Agenda. And each year this subcommittee performs its oversight function by approving the research agenda for the Office of Education Accountability for the following year. And OEA staff, who has been here today to present already, will be presenting the proposed research agenda for 2022, and a copy of which has been provided in members' meeting materials. And if you would, please, Dr. Liguori, I'll let you once again introduce yourself for the record, and you may proceed.
Good afternoon. My name is Bart Liguori from the Office of Education Accountability.
Marcia Seiler, Office of Education Accountability.
Thank you.
And we have two studies on the agenda, plus the district data profiles. The first is the review of school funding adequacy studies. This study will review the most recent studies measuring the cost of an adequate public education in Kentucky and similar states. We'll focus on the methods used in those studies, the outcomes of those studies, and the costs associated with educating special student populations. Also, in addition to that study, OEA will produce a memorandum detailing which states use membership in their school funding calculations, the manner in which membership is determined, and the estimated costs of using membership in the C calculation instead of average adjusted daily attendance. This memorandum will be submitted in writing to the ears by February 1st, 2022. Also, the second study would be, the second proposed study is the credit recovery study. This study will examine the use of credit recovery in Kentucky schools and districts. The study would examine the extent to which credit recovery is used at the state, regional, and district level. This study will include an examination of the types of credit recovery methods used, the impact of credit recovery on graduation rates, and which students are most impacted by credit recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any members, any questions or any comments? There's a motion that's made to accept the 2022 research agenda as presented. Do we have a second? We have a second from Representative Bojanowski. All those in favor of accepting the 2022 research agenda presented by OEA, please do so by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? The motion does carry. Thank you all so much for being here. Looking forward to the steps ahead for this 2022 research. Seeing no further agenda items, no further comments or questions, no further business, do we have a motion for adjournment? So moved. Thank you all so much.